My name is Ermina Takenova, and I'm an illustrator and animator from Kazakhstan, currently living and working in London. I was born in Almaty, Kazakhstan, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I think my cultural identity is a bit of a mix of Kazakh and Russian cultures with some leftover specifics of a Soviet lifestyle still present in my childhood, for example, my school education, that I think also had a bit of an influence on me. My family practices some Kazakh traditions, but I think overall I grew up a bit detached from my own culture. For example, I don't really speak the language. I grew up in a predominantly Russian speaking and urban environment. And when I was 15, I moved to England to study. And I think when I was away from my home and my family, I really felt the need to reconnect to my culture and to explore it and understand it better. I am learning about my own culture through my artistic practice. It's an ongoing research, as I think I'm constantly learning a lot of new things. I usually use historical archive photography to study people's way of life and read as much as possible. And I think I connect with the culture very visually because I don't speak the language, so my inspiration comes from looking at it and like studying and observing the little details. I started working on a series of illustrations last year that is predominantly focused on exploring the representation of Kazakh nomadic women, and each piece tells a story, and they're either intuitive or they focus specifically on some aspect of a culture or tradition. I love studying traditional clothing, everyday household items, and decorations of the Kazakh nomads. And when it comes to traditional clothing, I think so much history and a lot of its symbolism and variety has been lost and stripped down during the colonization and Sovietization experience. For example, there is a bridal headdress that is quite detailed and quite beautiful. It's called saukile. It's a tall, cone-shaped headdress. The taller it is, the richer the family, so the headdress is meant to show the status of the bride. It was very detailed, very embellished, and each piece of embellishment and each piece of ornament had its own meaning. It could take up to a year to create one of them, and there's a really interesting history behind it. So, allegedly, a similar headdress throughout history was a part of clothing that was worn during ancient burial rituals. A lot of bridal traditions are centered around death and revival. The bride kind of like dies before the marriage ceremony to trick the ancestral spirits. So her whole family would cry for her as if mourning her death. So she has to trick the ancestral spirit to then be reborn in her husband's tribe. So she kind of does this journey in the underworld, and that's the history behind it. I have a piece titled Nomadic Womanhood, and it depicts a woman with three heads. The three heads were like three different headdresses. Each one represents a different stage of a woman's life. So when she's a young girl, she wears a takia. When she's a bride, she wears a saukile. And when she's a mother, a married woman, a mother, a grandmother, she wears a headdress called kimishek. And kimishek is a head covering, like a white head covering, often worn with a tall turban on top. And you could also tell like a status of a woman by looking at how tall her kimishek is. And there's so much variety on how they were worn, and you could usually tell what tribe the woman belonged to or what region she's from by how she wore it. And it looked something like this. And I love looking for small little details as well. I love finding these little gems of information. Like, for example, I've recently learned a really interesting story. So, Kazakh nomads had really beautiful wooden chests in their yurts, and they had detailed ornamental carvings, and sometimes they had bone or silver inlay. So, the elderly Kazakh nomadic women wore the keys to the chest on the ends of their braids. And I find it so mysterious and intriguing because considering there were many layers of clothing and had head coverings, it would be really difficult to steal the keys from them. Looking at the history like from a female's perspective, I cannot help but challenge and question the more patriarchal traditions. For example, there's a tradition called Jeteata, which means seven fathers or seven ancestors. This tradition obliges every Kazakh person to know their ancestors up to 7 generations back. The Kazakh genealogical tree is called Shizhire, and unfortunately, traditionally, names of women are not added to the genealogical tree. So I do not know the names of my female ancestors um, who were before my great grandmothers. So I created a piece called Jete Ana, meaning seven mothers, and it's my imaginary genealogical tree following a female lineage. I want to show the strengths of nomadic women. They live challenging lives and they have to be physically strong. There's a lot of hard labor involved in their lifestyle, and the environment itself demanded strength and resilience. And what bothers me now is that nowadays, a lot of people in Kazakhstan who consider themselves more conservative or claim to be more traditional pushing this idea of what a true Kazakh woman should be like, and it usually means quite submissive and fragile. And I think due to the lack of education on our culture and history, we end up with people creating their ideas of an idealized past, and they often would end up trying to pigeonhole women into submissiveness under the guise of protecting our culture and traditions. On one hand, we have the sacralization of a woman and her role as a mother and as a wife, but on the other hand, currently we have quite a big issue of domestic violence and sexual harassment and laws that unfortunately don't really protect women. I am interested in exploring female demons from Kazakh mythology because I think to me personally, those visuals of those demonic women kind of represent power, and I think they also represent power that many would find intimidating. Hence, it's looking so like evil and dangerous. For example, there is a female demon from Turkic mythology called Albastı, and she's described to have long tangled hair and saggy breasts that she throws all over her shoulders. This is my depiction of Albastı, and she can bring nightmares and diseases. According to the beliefs, she is especially dangerous to women in labor. So she steals the lungs of an expectant mother, but the victim won't die until Albastı throws the woman's lungs into a body of water. To me, it's such a striking and powerful image. Like I am heavily inspired. I've always been heavily inspired by surreal art, and I think that's why I enjoy this mythological realm because I can really explore those stories and create surreal visuals. One of the main driving forces in my creative practice is decolonization. And this is a concept that I first learned from interactions with the other Kazakh artists and curators, for example, specifically curator Egerim Kapar. And I think looking back at the history and exploring it, I've realized that the Tsarist and Soviet history isn't as explicitly talked about as colonialism. And I've also realized that there are reasons why I grew up a bit detached from my own culture, and that's why I'm on this journey to reconnect with it. And so much of our history has been lost and not properly taught to us for many years. And if anything, it has also been presented to us as something inferior and primitive. And it was generally a violent and a traumatic past. For example, the nation lived through horrific famine, artificial famine, and there have been political repressions, and Kazakhstan was essentially turned into a massive prison camp. My family was also affected by Soviet political repressions as well, and I have family members living through the famine period too. I think nowadays Kazakhstan is going through a challenging time of reconnecting, reevaluating, and rebuilding our cultural identity. And I think it's going to be a challenging period, and I don't know how long it'll take. When talking about decolonization, I feel it's very important to keep the balance of not entering a dangerous territory of national exceptionalism. So we can be proud of our culture, but we can also welcome diversity, and we also have to understand that diversity is a part of our history too. A lot of my work is done digitally, and what I like about it that due to its ease of sharing and reprinting, some of my works get to live their own lives. For example, a few illustrations from the series I've just talked about have been exhibited in Kazakhstan this year without me being present. And I also enjoy sharing my work on social media because I treat it as my visual diary, and I also love sharing what I learned. I do enjoy working with traditional media as well, like, for example, watercolor, and I also love drawing with a biro pen and pencil as well. And because I do like the feeling of working directly with paper. I think with traditional materials, it's more intuitive, and I think like what is also interesting about it that you can have like nice experiments and nice accidents happening because you can't really fully control the material, but digital can be more controlled and there's a bit more flexibility. But at the same time, sometimes I feel it's more challenging because it's less intuitive because you're not working directly with the material. And when I personally work digitally, I like to try and imitate more traditional mediums as well, like an ink line or like pencil. And so, sometimes it's a challenge, but it's an interesting challenge. Sometimes I worry about the historical accuracy of my visual explorations, and like at times I find contradicting information or there's too much of it, and I just feel confused and a bit overwhelmed. So I'm trying my best to navigate through it, but at the same time, I also realize that there are a lot of disagreements on our history, and there are like some subjects that are argued about by the general public as well. So I think it's we're all kind of like in the same boat of like navigating through it. And that's where I let my intuition guide me for a lot of pieces. Like I read as many resources as I can, and then I try to process it visually, and I create a lot of images intuitively. And that's where my interest in surreal art really helps, because then I kind of take the the stories from the culture and the mythology as a basis and create images with a surreal twist. I do love really intense shading and shaping. For example, like here, it almost feels like carving out an image and like giving it volume. At times, I start without pre-sketching an image, so I just draw completely intuitively. I just start on it and then see what comes out. And I think that's where it's also a nice balance between digital and traditional, because I can explore and let my imagination just run wild. I would say that for me, a lot of the influence and inspiration comes for my visual style comes from Scythian animal style art. Like for example, like this drawing was directly influenced by it, and I'm inspired by the shapes of it and like how the animals were depicted, or like the craft of it. And I'm also inspired by Turkic stone statues, especially when I draw faces. I kind of like follow like, the facial, like the simplified facial features of those statues, and also petroglyphs, because I think there's so much ingenuity in its simplicity. Like it communicates the message so well, and it's so visually striking. There was a lot of influence from a Soviet artist, Yevgeny Sidorkin, who was also inspired by similar sources as well. 2019 was a turbulent year for Kazakhstan, marked by protests, unlawful arrests, and harassment of activists. It wasn't all very new for Kazakhstan. There has been activism and protests and opposition and political repressions before the 2019 events. But I feel that year was unique with its much wider social media coverage and more voices from the younger generation. There was also greater solidarity from around the world, from the Kazakh diaspora, and a lot of uncomfortable conversations were taken to social media, and people were using the social media platforms to have discussions. Police brutality towards peaceful protesters was truly appalling, and even the elderly weren't spared. People were grabbed and thrown into the police vans. There's a lot of force and cruelty. We are a culture that prides itself in honoring the elderly, but unfortunately, the current reality is completely different on a systemic level. And for me, seeing all those instances of violence towards the elderly from the police, I was inspired to create a character called Super Appa. Appa means grandmother in Kazakh, in the region where I'm from. I wanted to create like an empowered elderly character, and like somebody the police wouldn't be able to pick on. She was inspired by both of my grandmas, and also the actual idea and the concept was inspired by a character my brother created years ago when I was a toddler. He drew little comic strips about the super baby, who was a baby superhero, and it was based on me. Earlier this year, I made an animated AR filter for Facebook and Instagram, which lets you put an animated protesting crowd in an environment. And this little project was my response to yet another instance of cruelty towards peaceful protesters. So this project was also partially inspired by the constraints of the pandemic, and I wanted it to be an opportunity for anyone in the world to be able to show some solidarity to the brave. Kazakhstani citizens who do go out and protest. And this filter features Superpa in it as well. Like, so she's floating above the crowd, and I have like multiple slogans as well, like touching on like issues that get discussed the most and in three languages, so it switches between English, Kazakh, and Russian. Last year, I made a very short animation titled "Laser Nipples," which was my direct response to quite a nasty incident that happened in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, when when an alt-right group was protesting a feminist exhibition with participants from 22 countries, including Kazakhstan. And basically, the protesting group wasn't happy with some performances and some art pieces that featured female nudity. And they were making quite a ridiculous claim how like it's immoral and we can't have female nudity in museums, and which is quite a ridiculous statement in itself, because like museums are filled with images of nude women like worldwide, and it's a subject that has been explored in art for centuries. And I think my very first reaction was outrage, of course, and because like the part of the exhibition ended up being censored, some of the more provocative artworks were removed, and the museum director even left her post after that. And then I was thinking about it a little bit more. Obviously, I was experiencing a lot of anger about it, and but then I kind of started laughing to myself a little bit more, and then I had this image in my head of this Godzilla-like giantess shooting lasers out of her breasts and like melting men and destroying everything, because I was just thinking like is why is it so scared of female nudity and like a female body, and it's very natural and there's nothing shameful about it or immoral. Generally, I think this piece is inspired by how female bodies go through a lot of censorship and a lot of scrutiny all the time. I mean, like so many social media platforms notoriously censor images featuring female nipples, but not male ones, and but female breasts and nipples have like an important function. They literally keep babies alive. So I don't understand why does it go through such heavy censorship, and why there's such a sense of shame around it. I think in my artistic practice overall, I do find it important to look towards the past and explore the past history and mythology and culture. And it's also important to me to look at contemporary issues. And I think it's all interconnected because, as I was talking earlier, decolonization is an important concept for me and something I would like to explore in my art. Because I think a lot of the issues we're going through nowadays take roots from this violent colonial past, and it's a big trauma for that the whole nation is going through. And I think it's quite a universal experience worldwide. It's not only applicable to Kazakhstan, and yeah, that's why it's important to me to look through all those different time periods and like study them and see where exactly it takes root from, and where can we learn from the past in order to be able to progress and improve in like for our future.